Welcome to the gallery at Foyles. It's really nice to see you all here. Thank you to those of you that have squeezed in and are standing. I'm sorry we couldn't find chairs for you all, but it's lovely to have such a good crowd for tonight's event. Now, I'm not going to say very much. In a second, I'm going to hand over to Guy Shrubsole, who's going to introduce a little bit. Just to say a few things, if I could ask you all to keep your phones on silent or switched off during the event. Afterwards, this is obviously all tied into the fabulous book Regeneration. We have copies available just outside the gallery, which you can buy and pay for at the tills out there if you wish to, which I'm sure you will. Anyway, I would now like to hand you over to Guy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When Foyles told us that we'd sold out tonight, I thought that was just a comment on our politics. It's insufficiently radical. Hopefully not. This is Regeneration. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you all tonight and that you all come along to the launch of this book, which has been a huge pleasure to be involved in as one of the co-editors. This is a book about generational politics. It's principally a book about the generation that was born since 1979. And sometimes we're called Thatcher's children, and I can think of no finer insult to them. Sometimes, and apologies to those of you from the audience who do like Thatcher. Sometimes in more recent years we have been referred to as the lost generation. As unemployment has grown, we're seen as merely lost. But I disagree with this title as well. We're in fact organised, and we're getting angry, and we're no longer lost because. We're increasingly rejecting the consensus that has dominated the last 30 years of politics in Britain. Failed politics of individualism, of free markets, that's led to spiralling inequality and a plundered planet. For most of our lives we've been told that there are no real alternatives, that no other game in town anymore but free market, consumer capitalism. But it's not true. There are many alternatives that are open to the next generation, and some of these ideas and some of these new ways of organising and thinking about things are showcased in Regeneration. But we didn't just want to tell people about alternatives in producing this book, we also wanted to show people, because this has been not just a book about any one individual, but it's been a collective effort put together by 31 contributors, who I'd really like to pay tribute to you now. Not possible to sort of go into any great detail about every single chapter in this book necessarily, but I'd like to read down the names because it has been a huge effort. So I'd really like to thank the contributors Patrick Henry, Guy Aitchison, Christo Arbor, Martin Allen, Jamie Ardsley, Craig Berry, Guppy Bowler, Matthew Cheeseman, Clare Coatman, Chris Coltrane, Ray Phelan, David Floyd, George Gabriel, Tim G, Richard George, Paolo Gabaldo, Jeremy Gilbert, Deborah Grayson, Noel Hatch, Tim Holmes, Rena Cusapaulo, Ben Little, Becky Luff, Shiv Malik, Peter McCall, John Myers, Jim O'Connell, Adam Ramsay, Kirsty Schneeberger and Charlie Young, which without everybody's involvement obviously this would not have been a book, this would have been an idea. I'd also very much like to thank the Intergenerational Foundation, Liz and Angus, who've very kindly sponsored the publication of Regeneration and what's been launched tonight. I'd very much like to thank Lawrence and Bizhart and Sally. I don't know if Sally's here. Sally, who's been an incredible publisher to work with, extremely understanding, accepting drafts up until the last minute and beyond, of course. I'd also like to thank the Miliband Trust, who also sponsored the publication of the book. Most of all, I'd really like to thank Claire for being a fantastic co-editor, absolutely amazing, you're an absolute star, and Ben and Shiv, who've been incredible assistant editors, and Ben is also a series editor, so there was a book previously to this, about the future, and we're hoping it's going to be further, so he's taking on that in the future. Lastly, of course, I'd like to thank Miriam and Simon at Foyles for hosting this tonight. Thank you very much for giving us this venue. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Evan Davis, who really needs no introduction, but I will say that he is obviously the presenter on Radio 4's Today programme. Thank you very much.
to give birth to the book, and I must say I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I actually can honestly say I have not made up my mind about the book. I know that I like the people who are involved, and I know that there are a lot of horrible injustices to young people, but I'm genuinely here to make up my mind about the case of the book. It's not a manifesto, it's a book of essays. It's not one opinion, there are different perspectives in there, but they do gel because the authors all share what one might call a frame, which is the frame of intergenerational justice, and the sense that there's been some injustice perpetrated on the current young. What we're going to do is we're not going to have presentations or pitches, we're going to have an interactive hour. I'm going to ask questions, you're going to ask questions, and then we're all going to frame our views on the book, and then you're going to go and buy copies. That's the way. Let me just introduce the panel. Shiv, I mean, they're all contributors to the book. Shiv Malik is actually one of the co-founders of the Intergenerational Foundation. He also co-authored a book called Jilted Generation, How Britain Has Bankrupted Its Youth. He's actually writes for The Guardian as an investigative reporter. For each of them, I'm going to give you a line from the book, because I think if I just read you about 2 lines for each of them that they have written in the book, you'll get where they're coming from. Okay? So this is what Shiv wrote. They're not funny lines, by the way. They're not like punchlines. I'm going to give you a sort of pithy little bit, just a tiny bit. It's intergenerational comparisons that remind us that when they were our age, our parents had houses built for them, not in the hundreds, but in the hundreds of thousands every year. They enjoyed fixed private rents, and many of them grew up in a time when unemployment was astonishingly low. Claire, sitting next to me, Clare Coatman is a campaigner in the field of democratic reform in the Yes to Fairer Votes campaign, the Convention on Modern Liberty, and she's currently fundraising and marketing for open democracy. Claire's paragraph, I'm sure you're all interested in what paragraphs I've chosen. Claire's paragraph says, "We share a disillusionment over the way that politics has been conducted in Britain over the past 30 years and the apparent breakdown of the social contract between generations. But we also share a desire to come up with better alternatives, not just to say no to the old ways of things, but emphatically yes to new solutions." And that is something the book tries to do. It tries to be positive as well as negative. Deborah wrote the conclusions of the book, and has spent a lot of time campaigning on climate change, democratic participation, electoral reform, and is starting work for the Coordinating Committee for Media Reform, which sounds very interesting. And she's doing a Masters in Political Communications at Goldsmiths. Deborah, your paragraph says, "The first step towards reclaiming our future has been to vocalise the fact that many of the things we've been offered as choices, temporary work contracts, short-term leases, have felt more like prison than freedom. The demands of the neoliberal labour market, requiring us to be flexible, mobile, independent and capable of navigating uncertainty, are not easily compatible with having dependence." And in the conclusion, Deborah sort of raises the issue as to who's going to have kids if life is miserable and we're all working the whole time. Adam Ramsay is co-editor of the blog Bright Green. He's active as a manager for the student network People and Planet, and involved in a number of other activist groups in Oxford and nationally. And Adam, your line is, "If there's a lesson from the credit crunch," this is the bit I'm interested in because I'm sort of economics-y. "If there's a lesson from the credit crunch, it's surely that we cannot trust elites to invest our wealth. And if the lessons from the Highlands and the lessons from Latin America teach us anything," when it outlines examples in those places, "it's surely this: when communities come together, they make wise choices, they stand up for each other." Right, so that, ladies and gentlemen, is the panel. I mean, I'll tell you why I'm undecided. I'm undecided between 3 theories about this book, really. One is, I think if I'm sober, that it's a very interesting critique of the direction our economy and our state has taken over the last 30 years. But I'm sceptical of the idea that it's actually all about intergenerational stuff. That you can critique Mrs. Thatcher and her economics and her society without needing really to put it into some intergenerational frame. So that's one view I have. If I have one drink and I'm also warm and fuzzy and very friendly, I think actually this book is really a breakthrough book. It is really a very important document because it is a synthesis of a lot of thinking from the left with bits of thinking, believe it or not, from the right. It's not all just traditional left-wing politics. And the intergenerational frame turns out to be fantastically useful for looking at just about everything. You can take green politics and you can say, hang on a minute, greenness is really about what you're bestowing upon other people. So the intergenerational frame is what it's about, and it's all very interesting. Then if I get drunk, I just think, oh, it's all a bunch of rubbish. It's all another bunch of people saying society's not as good as it used to be. And we all actually know society's not actually going hand in hand. So that's my uncertainty. That's my uncertainty. I'm genuinely agnostic between those three views: the positive, the negative, and the one in between. What we'll do for the first few minutes, let me just ask a few questions because I think this will just help everybody understand where you're all coming from. Shiv, maybe you can start. You wrote a foreword to the book. A lot of it is an attack on neoliberal economic values that are dominated in the policy sphere in the UK. Just take us through why those values in particular have hurt your generation.
I was going to say, give this man one glass of wine. I would say that, in essence, if you want, intergenerational politics is about time, in a sense, and how time and over time, groups of people are affected by certain modes of thinking, certain policies, and certain outcomes. So I would say, certainly for how neoliberalism, and it's wider than simply the economics of it. It's really the ideas, perhaps, let's say, broadly speaking, of freedom. And I mean, as you said, it's not a manifesto, we disagree. So I would come from my own personal perspective on this, which is to say that actually our generation is perhaps one that embraces freedom and the notions of freedom, Thatcherite freedom, if actually you want to say, in many ways. And we certainly sort of view the internet in that sort of way. We're quite expansive. I can see the nasty stares already appearing from my co-founders. But we should perhaps be honest with ourselves and realise that actually globalisation, in a sense, has given us this ability to travel in ways perhaps that we wouldn't be able to used to. And let me give you one definite example. I can use my credit card in India. I couldn't do that 10, 15 years ago. And that's perhaps one expression of freedom. On the other hand, we have traded that, if you want, in a sense. And it's not a choice given to us, because it's one bestowed upon us, for security. And this is the problem, that we find ourselves with lots of choices, and perhaps, as Deborah says, I think it becomes a sort of a prison. It's lots of choices, but none that really are, in a sense, viable. So take the housing situation, for example. Sure, you can rent, you can buy, but we don't have the resources to buy, generally speaking, because house prices in this country are incredibly high even now. So we find ourselves privately renting, which is still, government is to say, is a choice. Oh, look, all these people choosing to rent. Isn't it wonderfully popular? And it's growing year by year. Well, if you actually ask people, they say, well, we're stuck because we can't do anything else, and it's incredibly expensive. So, I mean, digging down, there's little things like that. Actually, you find the world turned upside down. So it's really about looking at, as I said, how it's affected.
So it's more than the economics, it's about individualism and that whole philosophy of make your own way and fight your own way, and actually it turns out it's a fight. Deborah, I was struck quite a lot of the chapters. One of the most interesting chapters actually is the one about nightlife. I can't remember who wrote it actually.
It's Cheese Matches.
Which is a description of the sort of sordid things. I mean, it was kind of a cross between the Daily Mail account of the hideousness of nightlife with a really quite advanced and radical critique of the capitalist system that encourages or entices people to find pleasure in that kind of escape. I mean, just talk us through your view of consumerism and where you stand on material acquisition and all that kind of stuff.
Well, I'd say, they start with talking about the end of history from Diana's idea in the early 90s that we've reached the end of history. And I'd say that there was a point, maybe in, that that period, maybe 1992, kind of maybe the financial crisis, when there was a real sense of like there really is no alternative and nothing is going to just destabilise this. This is just what it is forever. And actually that is extremely psychologically damaging. So for me, like the seminal texts of that period are Fight Club and American Psycho and Trainspotting, which are all stories about people who feel so overwhelmed by the need to accumulate material possessions that they run off in this crazy state searching for something real. And the only real thing is a kind of alternate reality of drugs or the internet or fighting, you know, and this sense of actually there's nothing. I mean, you can read it in a completely Ramsay way. There's nothing meaningful about just endless choice of identical objects, which are constantly giving you this desire to consume more and more, and yet you can never ever be satisfied by the fetish. So I think that there is a growing sense amongst young people, and obviously there's a divide. I mean, the riots were obviously violent shopping. That's what happens when kids grow up in a world where the only thing that is meaningful is getting the trainers and the phone. And we're starting to see that actually it's not a good way to run a society. Like, there was definitely an idea of the Second War, or probably a longer heritage, that trade is the alternative to war, that if you get people excited about consuming things, then they'll stop being excited about religion or ideology and stop fighting each other. But actually it kind of undermines the very basics of what it is to be human, which is only to have relationships.
There was another interesting chapter, wasn't there, about the Spanish protesters, the indignados, and how they're not in the kind of way that one might think they're having a bit of a good time at the party in Plaza Mayor. They're not really drinking, and they're kind of quite disciplined, quite abstemious almost.
Yeah, and he draws a parallel between, say, Reclaim the Streets and the kind of 1990s rave culture, consumerist exuberance, and how actually in the current moment that's inappropriate. We're living through an age of austerity, an age of difficulties. People's lives are hard, they're getting harder, and actually it's kind of taking the piss a bit to go and kill protesters from the party.
Yeah. Claire, we said the book is positive as well as negative. I mean, it doesn't just want to be a great sort of protest without any, because this is the book, the protest can be anti, but the book has to have a little bit of positive, have a few ideas. Just take us through some of the things that have impressed you in the book that might kind of sort of could be put onto a policy agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think the structure of the book is something I particularly like. So there are specific policy suggestions, yes, for example, Kirsty's about having an ombudsman for future generations. I think it's a powerful idea. There are also chapters about the way in which we can organise ourselves. I think that's very positive in looking for the next practical steps. How are we going to get to where we want to be? As well as chapters looking at whole paradigm shifts and really, with a blank piece of paper, how would we organise society? What could it be like? And if we scrap baby boomers concepts, where could we go? I think it was striking for me that from the very first meeting to the very last phone call, it was mentioned that we wanted to be solutions orientated. And yes, the book does focus to some extent on what the problem is, but I think that's the first step to working out what the solutions are. And I think it's not to be underestimated what it takes to articulate that. I mean, Shiv's forward, he talks about writing to InterGeneration and saying, less than 2 years ago, Shiv went to an economics and history professor and was told there is no value in the intergenerational frame. And how far we've come from that to now, where it's a concept much more in people's minds. But the most positive thing about it for me is that not only are we saying we get a bit of a raw deal if we look at it, and that should be changed, we're also saying in changing that for ourselves, we mustn't repeat the mistakes of the generation that came before in only sorting things out for ourselves. We have to be the generation that puts our foot down and reaches a situation where life is good for all throughout society.
And I mean, there are various points that everybody says. It's not about beating up the baby boomers. I mean, it's not about trying to kind of create a fight. Although in certain policy areas there are, I mean,
Pensions.
there are pension policies like the solution to my pension is to dump it on you, and that sounds very attractive to you. I suppose, but you're not trying to pick a fight, and you're not pitching it that way.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's going to take collaboration throughout the whole of society.
Adam, I just want you to expand, because your chapter actually is a very positive chapter. I haven't read the whole thing, by the way. I've only read select bits, but your bits, you go through alternative models to the kind of elite-driven financial capitalism we live in. Why don't you just tell them about one or two, how they work, so that we can see some things?
Sure. I guess, having never participated in these, I can't tell you how they work in detail. And what I was talking about particularly was the way that we choose to invest what economists, or Marxist economists, call surplus value. So you've done some work and you create enough that you need, and what do you do with the rest of it? And at the moment, most of that in our economy goes off to our banking elites, and they gamble with it, and sometimes that gambling destroys the whole economy, the whole house of credit cards collapses. And what's been interesting for me over the last decade or so is that, particularly in places like across Latin America particularly, people have started to look at this question anew. So rather than doing what traditional movements of the left demanded, which was that the state takes control of its capital, you have large state-owned institutions and they choose investments. The various political parties of the Latin American left, starting with the Brazilian Workers' Party in the late 80s, but more recently, particularly in Bolivia and other places, said that no, what we're going to do is empower communities to make those decisions. So when the Brazilian Workers' Party got control of various cities across Brazil, they used the budgeting powers they had to empower people. So they said, we're not going to make the decision about how we invest this bit of capital, we're going to hand that decision over to you. So, so they got people together in their communities, they had mass meetings, they facilitated these discussions, and they got people to make those sorts of choices. And that started in 1989, and over the course of 2 decades, this model spread rapidly across Latin America. Spread rapidly partly because it's very successful, and partly because people turned out, even in Latin America where there's huge numbers of illiterate people turned out to be much better at investing in their communities, at knowing what their community needed and what that surplus value would best used for than any one elite, because they're the people closest to the ground. So even the World Bank, who aren't prone to praising radical Brazilian socialist parties, I've written numerous reports saying, actually, if you look at these cities, they've got much better budget processes for eliminating poverty and for investing in the things that the communities need than kind of conventional processes. And the thing that's interesting for me is partly the economic model, partly the extension of that principle. That, because of course what they were doing was taking what the left is used to controlling, which is the city budgets, the state, and these things which are already democratized, tax money and so on, and investing it, and taking that principle and seeing and thinking about how we can apply it more broadly. So we have a largely privatized world. Most money isn't held by city mayors. Most money is collected by private institutions and filtered up to banks that way. And so the first question is, how can we work out how to take surplus value more broadly and invest it more broadly? And for me, there's also an important question that we have to ask ourselves as the left. I don't know if you identify as left, but I do, about political economy, because you can't have a perfect economic model controlled by a few people that no one is willing to fight for. And the principle of universalism, the principle that was introduced largely for a political reason, to build solidarity between the middle classes and the working classes, didn't work. We lost. And I'm all in favour of universalism, but we've got to ask ourselves that political question: how do you build an economic model as the left, and use the levers that we potentially have now? How do you build an economic model as the left, which doesn't just secure justice, but also empowers people to fight to maintain that justice, not just for our generation, almost future generations? And so the exciting thing about questions in Latin America for me is not just that they've been very good. The World Bank says we don't understand how Brazil has managed to develop so rapidly. And I'd say a lot of the answer is because of this community empowerment. A lot of it isn't just that, it's that those people now, there are whole movements across a lot of those countries who, every time someone comes and threatens to privatise their water supply or to take these things away from them, they will be out on the streets and they will barricade and they're empowered and they will fight back and people are dead. And so, really, it's economics. You can't think of economics without understanding the political movements we're building around that.
Okay, well, you've had a little taste, really, of some of the views that are expressed in the book. Who wants to ask a question? Or maybe even make a comment if it's not a speech, you're welcome to. Yes, we'll take on that. Go.
Right. So my name is Guy Aitchison, and I contribute to the book as well, but I'm a bit like you, Evan, I sort of don't really share the framework, and I'm not convinced that, well, there may be a generational dimension in some senses, but I don't think it's in any way interesting, except in the most trivial sense. Because, I mean, like, what's the point of asserting a kind of collective political identity, like feminist movement, black civil rights movement, workers' movement? It's to kind of change things politically, right? So it involves like a descriptive claim about society, that there's like an imbalance of power, and like a political claim about how power should be. So for example, with women, you could say, okay, women are excluded from lots of political positions, lots of economic positions in society, the same with other forms of discrimination, but with the generational stuff, I just don't think it's true. I just don't.
So the difference in generations is, of course, we all young at some point, and we're all old at some point, or many.
I'm
and that's different from being black or being gay or being female.
Yeah, but I think age and generation is very different, and it's a very different thing to have changing circumstances and changing opinions as you go through your life, compared to having whole bands of society that are worse off or better off than previous and successive bands. And I think that what the generational lens brings is it's a challenge to governments who don't see beyond the next election. That we need a mechanism whereby it has to be on the agenda to think about what happens down the line.
I would add that it's a useful tool to try and understand what's going on, like class is a tool, and lots of discourses are tools of kind of bringing things out. And what you miss, I mean, what I always say is that here we have a generation that's basically dependent. Either the rich within that generation are dependent upon, ultimately still upon their parents to be rich and to either inherit wealth or to buy houses or to do those basic things in life, like get a job because they have to do unpaid internships and therefore be supported. Or even the poor within that generation who are also dependent on the state in many cases for benefits or in social housing. And then you have a sort of a rump in the middle who are also still kind of basically going both ways. And it's awkward when you have a dependent generation, because what you end up with is a further growing inequality later on, because obviously only the children of the rich then end up in a better privileged position. So it's actually a mechanism, if you want, of also recognizing that there'll be further class division. So it does lots of work, and that's just one example. But I think when you start to see things through that way, you just get different and sort of a better multiplicity of answers.
Can I just ask, did you want to answer that specific point?
I can chip in or not?
Yeah, chip in, and then
I think the thing is, to an extent, Guy, I agree with you. I don't think that generational politics are useful as an identity politics like race or class or gender. I think what's interesting, though, is that because when the government in Britain and other countries look at how they're going to withdraw things that people have had, they've realised that it's easier to take it away from people who've never individually had it than it is to take it away from people who currently have it. There is an asymmetry in how, for example, government cuts are being pushed through, not just in this country but around the world. And understanding that they've made that strategic choice is useful tactically. That doesn't mean to say it's useful identity politics, like others. It's
a really, really important point. And then you add the fact that there's a very different propensity to vote among different groups in the population. What I did want to just follow up though is, you said you were left-wing. Would you all describe yourselves as left-wing? Because I said there are little bits of conservatism in the book, and I want to just position you all kind of left-right. That's my old Well, or tell me that it's just a stupid old politics way of looking at the whole thing, and I just don't get it. But I mean, I'm sort of interested in where you are.
I work for the Guardian. Libertarian or whatever. No, I'm not. I would frame the context in this. It would be the libertarians who encompass both the economic and the social side very much have dominance.
Yeah.
And there are people who are outside of that framework who are challenged, and they come from different spectrums.
I'm not trying to say you don't have to put yourself. What about Deborah?
I mean, I describe myself as a lefty in general life, because that's probably like what fits closest
if we're going to pigeonhole you,
to where the spectrum is.
Yeah.
But I also, I mean, surely we all recognise that there are huge problems with the idea of this spectrum from left to right. And I mean, in terms of the kind of, I mean, you say you're left, but in terms of that kind of community-based stuff, I mean, there's a whole tradition of much more conservative thinking that interacts with that. I mean, you could completely create an argument for that would really sell to small C conservatives across the country.
Yeah, you'd be wrong.
The interesting thing is, you see, where you got to in the book is, my goodness, neoliberal economics, forcing everyone to be an individual and look after themselves and get this job and they'll all be on short-term contract. I think the right have understood, the socially conservative right have understood, that actually doesn't give you family-supporting jobs, communities where people own houses because everyone's renting on short-term leases. And there's a kind of a strain of thinking that says, I mean, Mrs. Thatcher was a bit, you know, ambiguous, because on the one hand she was economically liberal, on the other hand she was quite socially conservative. And there was often a clash between those two things, you know.
No one's saying that her programme made sense.
Yeah.
No. Well, up to a point you could say both of those things had certain common policies. But if it comes to, say, Sky TV, you know, instinctively she's pro-Sky TV, right? Right-wing, liberal economics. On the other hand, Sky TV just means 100 channels of kids being sold pizza. And if you're a kind of parent wanting to sit down to a roast meal on a Sunday lunch, it doesn't work because the mother's out working in Asda, which is not Thatcherite at all. So it's a very strange mix, really.
But I mean, in economic terms, I mean, neoliberalism has got absolutely nothing to do with free markets. It's all to do with monopoly. What has created, what's come out of that is, you know, there's no free market in any area of the economy really. So it's always been about creating a set of arguments that sort of make sense to enough people, and there's enough like initial sweeteners to the deal that they'll vote for it, but you know, it doesn't actually.
Let's take let's take another contribution. Yes, madam, in the black. Yeah.
I think a lot of times in the book, intergenerational politics is quite interchangeable with youth politics. I think it's quite an interesting question, is that if we woke up tomorrow and found out that pensioners in this country are worse off than young people in this country, whether the ideas spouted and the people involved would put all their kind of campaigning and work into addressing the lives of all.
Well, I would say, in a way, historically, it's always been that way, as you described. People who don't work are usually very poor. And that mechanism, in a sense, was attempted to correct it. Well, people tried to attempt to correct that through pension system, which is one of the first forms of social security that this country certainly developed, and other countries followed. So, I mean, that's been the fundamental thing. If you work, and generally labour was difficult and done by young people because they were, you know, most energetic. They didn't suffer from ailments, etc. And they were most readily employable. We now live in a very different world. In a very short period of time, that's completely changed. And to the point where, in fact, the OECD in 2008, and all their data was pre-recession, showed that in the last 25 years, you were more likely to be poor by virtue of being young than at any time in their measurements. So, I mean, that's a remarkable turnaround. And as I said, it puts young people on the back foot. Now, maybe it's just because of that, you know, we're going, oh, hang on, what's going on with life? What's happened to all our supposed dreams of being able to do the basic things that our parents did? But I think in a sense, that's probably answer the thing, we would be fighting the other way, perhaps. People did.
Yeah.
Obviously, one of the problems with coming to the book, which is, but one of my concerns with looking at things on a generational platform is that any time you segment people based on a really limiting factor, you are therefore excluding. So there's a lot of talk about people's parents having opportunities for mortgages and jobs and various things, and that's missing out a whole load of people in other generations who did not have that opportunity and never had that opportunity. And it's suggesting that the opportunities that were available to certain groups of older people that were never available. And it sort of does bring you to the point, if you want to be really difficult about it, and saying actually, are the parents of the people who wrote the book, did they have mortgages and jobs that a lot of people have never had for generations? And in which case are the people a lot better off? Because there's poverty and lack of wealth in their own sphere, but actually have access to educations and homes of parents that other people and poor people in this country never had. And how do we embrace them as women?
It's a very important question, isn't it? Because if you caricature unfairly the book as saying that lot had it better than we had it in the past, you need to make sure you're picking a representative sample of that lot rather than looking at the ones. So it's an important point. Does anyone want to?
I think just something I want to pick up on is that and only addresses a very small part of your quite big question. Sorry for that, but I think just to clarify that it's not that we're saying we want those things, it's that we're saying that those things were massively unsustainable and we're the ones that suffer, and that we need to get to a place where that doesn't happen again for further generations.
Anyone else wants to try and give an answer to that?
It's a difficult question, and only half, but only half an answer. Half a difficult question. But I mean, I think for me I think you're right to an extent, and you've got to have those fears. And that's also true, I said before that I don't think generational politics works as an identity politics, but even if you look at identity politics, you could make the same allegations against feminism, against black movements and so on. And I wouldn't. What I'd say is you've got to understand that oppression is complex and it has a whole lot of different flavours, and you can't accept them against each other. You must allow them to organise as themselves and who they want to, and understand that oppression isn't just based on class, although it's also based on class. But I think the useful thing about generational politics as a frame, particularly what a lot of us are trying to do with this book, isn't so much shouting about the oppression, but using it as a way to look forward and to plan. It's a way of saying, well, we're all in this together. People tend to, by the point of their own 20s, begin to work out what they're trying to do with their lives. And so let's all try and work out what we want to do with the world in our lives. And so a lot of the book isn't saying, oh my god, this is awful, we've been so screwed and that's not fair. It's saying, let's try and work out, as a generation who are about the same age, together, what we want to do with the world. And I think that is useful.
But actually, look, here's the crucial question. This is important to me, this one. Are we saying the intergenerational framework within which everything is put is the framework, the ultimate correct framework, class, feminism, all those? Well, are you saying, here's another very important framework. You can have more than one framework. They all have some insight. And it must be the latter.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're overlapping. But to me, the thing that's important about talking about things in generational terms is about resisting a kind of political discourse which blames young people for the situation they're in. And it's about actually reclaiming this and saying these things are structural, unemployment is high because it's structural, we're renting, can't buy houses, it's structural, and like trying to look at the wider circumstances for why young people, like as a group, are finding it harder to enter into the conditions of adulthood or the model of adulthood that we've been sold.
But the answer to the question is it's not incompatible with the things that might have been concerning you. So
I think my concern would be that in doing something that comes across as something that's generational, don't discount the large amounts of people within other generations that are going to be part of the solution.
It's not.
Because there's a danger.
And the book is actually really good about constantly saying it's not about
and also, very briefly, I think it's very much that we see this as the beginning of a conversation between generations and different groups and all sorts of things. It's very much not an answer or a full stop, it's the start.
But Deborah, I think Deborah's point, which actually we haven't said, which is the tendency for older to blame youngers is just the most unpleasant aspect of the whole intergenerational thing. Right, let's take the gentleman in red there. Yeah.
I'm interested that the quarter to 9 argument slot on the Today programme, Ollie Toynbee said universalism is dead. There's one Shibboleth's slave there.
This morning we're talking about.
Yeah. This is the International Year of Cooperation. Earlier it was mentioned religion, well, maybe come and go. The reality is that exciting movements come from the sort of people who are unlikely to be in this room here this evening. They are the people who generally are struggling to get by on multiple jobs, etc. Not people like me who've been to university working in charity, let's be honest. But all of what unites all of that, and I think why the importance of a generational book is we all aspire to something, whatever that is. Usually it's aspiring to better conditions for ourselves. And I suspect there'll be an element of sort of, well, we want better things for everyone else as well within the book. So where do you see the new movements within the UK that are actually mixing aspiration with what appears to sound like an element of social justice, or is that actually just a nice middle class thing to do? Because people who actually will benefit are those who are just trying to struggle to get on, and those at the top, well, they fought that fight multiple years ago and sit on the money now and just hope that, well, someone else pays their pension.
Okay, I'll go in that one then. I would say that writing Jilted Generation, you realise you've got to come up with a set of values in the end, about things that you think are most important. And the person I wrote it with is called Ed Hauker, who doesn't need to be here tonight, but he's, let's say, on the right wing of the traditional spectrum. And so we had a lot of argument and discourse on that. And the things that seemed quite central were work, families, and then communities outside of that. And those things were really very central. And I think that's what our generation is sort of struggling with. What's a kind of economic system that kind of works over the long term, i.e. for all sorts of generations, doesn't simply, in some cases, plunder from our generation, like house prices, and simply move wealth up to an older generation. So wealth can move that way through the age or generational spectrum. You know, what economic systems work, and then promote very simple things like work. I mean, the whole workfare stuff is really interesting. You get a discourse that says, you know, actually, working for free is like being educated, right? Working unpaid or learning in a supermarket, and I quote David Cameron when I say learning from a speech today, is actually just as good as being at school. What's the difference? And we could all swallow this as a group of 20 to 30-year-olds and grow up with that idea into our 50s, and why not, in a sense, unless we realise, hang on, this is affecting us. What ways is this affecting us? And it's affecting all of us. People coming out of uni, actually, the statistics show, are just as likely to be unemployed for a certain period as people who have, almost no GCSEs.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 or 3 points now, and then panel, I'll just run through and you just maybe take one each, okay? So I'd just like to get a few more comments. So we'll take, Sunny, is it Sunny? Yeah.
I think there's 2 challenges here. One is how do you make this conversation more broader and not just around middle class people. So a lot of the older campaigns, let's say black civil rights, they had to mobilize a lot of people. So the first problem is that actually a lot of the organizations of the left wing, say infrastructure right now, it doesn't mobilize that many people. So if you want to make this a broader conversation, how are you going to draw them into the fold? And the second challenge is, of course, that if I forgot the second challenge. Anyway, I think that's
yes, the gentleman there. Yes.
I just want to make a point about there was some discussion about different identities of groups, but we're not doing the practical work that Shiv Malik is saying they would have done because they're younger and healthier.
I mean, the economy has changed enormously, and basically we've changed blue-collar jobs into white-collar jobs over the last 40 years on a huge scale. And certainly for people who are not cut out for white-collar jobs and, working in banks and places like that, it's left them very bereft. Okay, good point. Yes, the lady in the second row, yes.
Surely comparing, our generation to the previous generation in terms of quality of life is a really difficult comparison to be making when you take into consideration that the current human population is way bigger than it was in previous generations.
Yes.
I don't understand why the what are the slides and the measures and what?
Okay. I mean, that's a very fair question. Yes.
I guess, if you think back to Adam Smith and his models, and he says that everyone is mobilised towards baubles and trinkets. And I think we're still in a situation where baubles and trinkets are what we all aspire towards. What would you see as the sort of practical new things you want people to aspire to? Because the riots were all about baubles and trinkets, but they're now iPhones.
Okay, fantastic. So we've got baubles and trinkets, the difficulty in making comparisons, the changing nature of the economy that explains and will inevitably, rephrasing your question, but it will inevitably explain quite a lot of what has affected your generation versus the older generation. It's not selfishness on the part of a generation, it's not even conscious, it's not even politics, it's just basically machines do manual jobs, and so we've got people in offices now. And then, Sonny, what was your point again? About making it all middle class, wasn't it?
Well, it was about mobilisation, but I just remembered my second question. Just briefly make that, which was, how do you put forward a positive vision of the future? Because the danger right now is it sounds like there's a bunch of young people just complaining about the fact that things are not good for them. So you almost need a positive vision, because the right can easily say, well, you've got iPhones, you've got things, we can give you a good vision of materialism and capitalism. It's not clear what these guys are saying is a good
right,
vision.
so the answer to that second point is, the book is the statement that answers the question, why isn't there more to life than iPhones? And why are we not better off than you, even though we've got iPhones? So you have to buy the book. But otherwise, let's just run down. Pick whatever those points you like.
Of course, it's difficult to make comparisons. I mean, the population in the UK hasn't changed that dramatically compared to the population of the world as a whole. But I think the point is, again, that the way that that people in power talk about young people's lives is very much framed on the way that people reached adulthood in the 1970s. And there isn't a sufficient understanding or acknowledgement of the structural changes that happened between then. And
you don't have to answer all of them, but I
think
you've done a good job.
But in terms of baubles and trinkets, I mean, I would say it's about having a stronger relationship to the material objects. It doesn't have to be a huge quantity of stuff, but if you've had more of a relationship, if you've done more, I guess, more things.
I'm not really going to work that. I think you need to just be a bit more specific. Actually, that's just a tiny bit.
Well, I mean, for example, when I was campaigning with Climate Rush, I loved the fact that I had a sash and I got really excited about my things, and I never get excited about like clothes and things. But actually, if you've imbued something with meaning, if you've created it yourself, if it's the work, like it's exciting to you. It's an awful lot more exciting than something that you've picked off a.
I think putting a slightly businessy hat on, I think that's what brands do. I think people genuinely think, ooh, it's diesel, that's the one I want. I mean, I feel an affinity. The other one doesn't look as good. It's deeply true. Well, speak for yourself. I mean, I think people come in on people actually what brands do is intensify the consumer experience. Instead of buying 30 pairs of Asda jeans which cover my legs perfectly well and cost £5 each, I'll buy one pair for 110, a diesel. And
I think that's fine. That's better.
Because that feels to me, that feels more eco as well.
If that's satisfying to you.
And instead of buying a box of biscuits, I'll buy a big box of a generic biscuit. I'll buy a Thomas the Tank Engine biscuit. No, the point is, you might say that's consumerism gone mad.
Make a biscuit with your own hands.
Right. Okay. So
I want to give you each a chance to come back and look at that range of 4 questions. So it's your turn now. Anything you want.
I'd like to talk about John's question on movement, but just very quickly, would you like time to read your children a bedtime story? Would you like to know your neighbours? These things are important to us as humans, and these are things that are much more important than baubles and trinkets. And even if not that, then the Romans believed in giving the poor bread and circuses, and at least circuses are collective fund. But to come back to the question about movement, I think that is the interesting one, because it's the real problem that I think we face. Because our generation is rubbish at joining anything. And if you look at whether it's trade unions, membership of trade unions has collapsed, and that's not coincidence, that was because of a conscious assault on the kinds of industrial relations which lead to trade unions, but because we have flexible labour markets, which means we move jobs every year, we move house all the time, so that doesn't just mean we don't do unions. The kind of community organising that Saul Alinsky writes beautifully about is very hard in our generation. If you go back to famous texts from even the 90s, Bowling Alone, and no one is a member of any community groups anymore, so how can you do community organising? And we have these serious questions to answer as a generation, because we go through these fleeting, exciting movements. We go, we have Climate Camp, we have UK Uncut, we have Occupy, and these things are all great and beautiful and wonderful, we should do more of them. But there's no infrastructure there, we don't have that capacity.
What's about social media? I mean, I hate that question because we ask it in every, when we run out of things to ask. What about social media? But what about social media?
Social media is very useful, because I spend far too much of my life on Twitter and trying to organise people through it. And yes, we can win, and these that are cool.
It's a social space, and it's an interactive space.
It is
frame views.
Yeah, and it can frame views, and it means that we don't necessarily need the same kinds of hierarchical organisations as in the past. We can get better at collective discussion, collective decision making. But it's not a movement, it's a place you can talk about stuff. And yes, it's a space that you can talk about stuff which facilitates movements, and in other countries it has helped in some ways to facilitate very exciting things. But looking to this country and to the question, last autumn, when asked the question, do you believe it's time to call system, do you believe we should call time on a system which puts people before profit, when in the context of framing around the occupation and anti-capitalist protests, 51% of people in this country said yes, and they are anti-capitalist, they do want to call time on a system which puts people before profit. Only 32%, I think, said no. And yet, in that country where 51% of people said they're anti-capitalist, we have no significantly powerful movement capable of stopping the government, even probably from destroying the NHS, the one last core of anti-capitalist institution in this country, and that is extraordinary. So the answer to your question is, I don't yet see where the big, powerful movements of millions of people are, but we better bloody start building them.
Let's take another couple more, 2 or 3 contributions, and we'll take the lady back there, yes, you, and then this one here, and then we'll go over to the gentleman with the beard, and the gentleman behind it, yeah.
Given that this is actually an international problem and has been growing since the 80s in places like Nigeria and the whole rise of gang culture and how would you tackle this on an international level, and especially in considering the kind of processes of how the economy has moved into a globalized structure, and how we don't really have centers of core admin, but are more distributed across.
I'm gonna rush you because I think we've got the questions very, very good.
I want to come back to the issue of intergenerational framework. We're not looking at it as more looking at these issues as local issues, maybe make more sense than putting generations against each other, so that should do to actually take away from people. For example, you pay for your pension. I mean, you'll have a good pension, it might not be coming out the exact out of your pot there, but you paid large contributions presumably over a long period because people saved up towards it in a way that they're not doing now. We're not saving. People are not saving the same way. We're not looking at how actually we work out what resources we need over lifetime as society, not just as individuals, and actually working ways that we can help individuals do that. Because it's not just about generations, because other generations will solve something that they're also not getting. People are retiring with not able to get the annuity.
So I think your point is that they're not, it's not intergenerational, there are people of all generations. The generation thing is helping you understand potential.
But actually, if we look at things from a life course perspective, and actually how we get back on track of doing that, we might actually be able to work out different ways to do ourselves.
Very good. Gentleman with the grey beard.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, let me declare an interest. If there's an intergenerational conflict, I represent the other. I've had it all, from my cod liver oil and orange juice when I was an infant to my university education. And now I've got a satisfactory pension. I've got no complaints, but nevertheless I have a great deal of sympathy with the views that are expressed around this room this evening because, well, not least because I've got grandchildren. The thing that bugs me is during the 1990s I had the opportunity to work for quite some time in a former Soviet country that had not long emerged from the Soviet Union. And I looked around there and saw plenty of evidence of the Soviet way of life, and I said, this I do not want. How do we rein in turbo-capitalism without losing the spirit of innovation, development, forward thinking, the good things, there are good things about free enterprise, and revert to that sort of drab uniformity? How do we balance the two?
That is a very, very interesting question. Because the one thing that I sometimes felt listening, reading bits of it, is that you didn't understand how bad lots of other things were. So I mean, you can critique the 30 years of Thatcherism, but there were lots of things that were bad apart from that. You don't want to build those. But we'll take one more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question is related to. My question is because the frame of the book seems to be basically about the Thatcher generation, kind of starting year zero with Thatcher, and I'm questioning how helpful Thatcher is in terms of the argument. Partly because, to what degree, and it's a question in terms of what's in the book, is to what degree does the book actually take a longer picture? Because certainly from my point of view as an only constituted Georgist, the real problem was what happened in 100 years ago. We were on the verge of actually a very different frame of society, a very different model of society. We were moving towards a welfare state that was a self-financing welfare state. We were moving towards land value taxation, a whole different way of funding the state. And then World War I happened, and not only did those ideas lose popularity, they all got written out of the economic textbooks. And so my question is, how useful is it to keep talking about Thatcher as if it all started going wrong with Thatcher, when my question is that actually in many ways Thatcher was a reaction to a somewhat unsustainable model that we'd had in the 30 years before Thatcher?
Well, very good questions. You all very good. Okay, I'm going to start again. We're just going to run down. Should always start. We'll start with Claire. You have first pick. Well, I think we'll just run through them. We have the question about, is the starting point right, or is that too arbitrary to start with sort of Thatcher generation? The point of how we maintain a vibrant entrepreneurship in our society while nevertheless getting rid of the excesses. The international point, how we internationalise, and whether the intergenerational framework is actually not quite capturing what's going on with people over their lifetime. Things like pensions.
Well, I shall pick vibrant entrepreneurship, and it's a relatively short answer, but I think that something that we teach about in the book is going down a much more cooperative route. And I think that's already seen to be very effective quite a lot in South America, where factories have been shut because the owner deemed them to no longer be profitable. And the workers who became unemployed from the communities that had devastated retook the factories, sometimes using an element of force, but very often legally. They secured the buildings and they got permission from judges to use the equipment to run the factory. And they all received an equal wage, considerably higher than they were on before. And the community that was devastated by unemployment is significantly rejuvenated. And I take a lot of hope from that, and I think that we would do well to go more towards that route.
Say, maybe merge that into the question about starting points and say there's been a bit of a battle, really, in certainly modern British history, probably also American as well, between the state and the individual. At least that's how it's been pitched. And for the left, perhaps the idea is that you take the levers of the state, and as long as that's democratic, then go ahead. Let's use that to transform society. On the right, it says, well, actually, look, it's individuals that are at the core of everything, and the state should get off people's back. Right? That's a very simplified argument. But there is something in the middle. No one is actually either an individual or someone who has the state bearing down upon them. We all live in this centre ground called sort of society and communities. And you're thinking of big society here, aren't you? But I'm not going down that route. In the sense that what does that mean in economic terms is actually far more interesting than simply passing it in cultural terms. So you're right, there was an economic idea well rooted in sort of British history, if you want, going back to sort of turn of the 19th century, 20th century, where people said, okay, look, these are economic ideas based upon kind of communities, cities. This is how we will develop a model, and that very much changed after total war. I mean, that would change an economy. Especially the Second World War, and then you had these giant state institutions, and that was the way to create a better world, if you want. And Thatcher decided, well, let's try the other mechanism and get rid of all of this, in a sense. So we're the generation living with that legacy. Perhaps, the route is transforming it through the middle, through communities.
Deborah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of people planning, I mean, I think what you were saying is, like, you've saved up and you're going to get your pension and
I frequently do. Take the international one.
The international one. It's definitely going to be a big one because obviously the world is incredibly unequal, and however hard done by we may think of ourselves being here, it's certainly nothing on a global scale. And I mean, I think Noel Hatch's chapter about being poorer and more powerful, trying to learn, take up techniques from places in the global south who've always been poor and have been learning how you can, create political change and create meaningful, viable, long-term existence. It's something. It's going to take a huge psychological shift, and it's something that I think is probably going to be. It's probably going to be the biggest downfall, to be honest, and the biggest challenge. It's the point at which it actually starts to be, tackling climate change is actually about reducing our own quality of life.
The big action, I mean, internationally at the moment, in this department, is obviously the young cohort, primarily in countries which has a very big young cohort, North Africa and in the Middle East, deciding they actually want, in some ways, a bit more of the kind of freedom and a bit more of the sort of, perhaps the consumerist colour and entrepreneurship that has been deprived of them. What sense do you make of it? Do you feel it's complementary to the book?
I mean, it's in the sense of, as Clare was saying, it's a clear demonstration of generational power. And in fact, as in TG's chapter when he talks about the forms of counter-power that young people are in a good position to exert, and obviously it's physical counter-power that young people are in the best position to exercise. But obviously, it only works because it was in conjunction with all sorts of other kinds of counter-power, particularly strikes. We're going to have to see what comes next, and it's going to be difficult because obviously it's not the young people that necessarily fomented the revolution that are going to be in a position of power afterwards. And I don't know whether having flexed their muscles in that way, it means that they're going to be in a stronger position to hold in a future government to account.
Well, we're all watching, basically.
Yeah.
To see what happens. Adam, have a
Yes, I thought it was an interesting set of questions, partly because Nishma over there kind of pre-answered a couple of the questions here to an extent for me. In that you were asked about future models that aren't just about centralising the state, and I think that is crucial. I think that the left of our generation, the left at the moment, whatever you want to call us, needs to understand that the reason that we haven't won is that we lost. And that's quite simple, but whether you're looking at Soviet-style sort of quasi-socialism, or whether you're looking at the social democracy that a lot of us look back to, there were some good things in those models, but there were serious failures. And for me, a lot of those failures are about centralisation, as was touched on. They're about the idea that you're taking power from one white man and giving it to another white man, and that one might mediate his power through the market, and that one might mediate it through bureaucracies, but they're still basically the same group of people making the same sorts of decisions. And the reason that Nishma's questions, kind of answered that for me, is looking whether it's Latin America or other places across the world. A lot of the movements who've been through what we're going through now
over the last couple of decades, a lot of people who fought back first against this sort of neoliberalism and are now building things that are new haven't turned immediately just to the state, although they've nationalised much more than we dream of nationalising in this country. What they've done is empower communities and invest in democratic control mediated by communities, by cooperatives, by mutuals, and so on. And that's been remarkably successful where it's been tried. And so for me, yes, the answer to the question here is exactly that. It's that we do need to understand that centralised states aren't the only way to do these things. Democratic control is what it's about, and that doesn't have to happen through the state. And yes, that has to look at land movements, and we have to, I'm a bit of a fan of Georgism, but land is not the primary factor of production in the economy anymore, so it's not the main thing. But yeah, we have to look at these things and how we root capital democratically, not just through centralised states. And I think there's plenty of models out there. We just need to go and look at that.
I think we've had a very good stab at this book, actually. I have to say, I'm aware that a lot of you are standing up, and it gets quite tiring standing up. But I'm also aware that the conversation can continue after you've bought your copy of the book. And so you have to go out and buy it, and then you will be able to read it all. We've only been touching on things. There's a fantastically interesting section on education, which I think is quite revisionist in its view of education. And there's loads which I haven't even read yet, so I would heartily recommend the book. I mean, I'll say what I really do like about it. Whether or not I'm convinced that the intergenerational framework is the framework through which we should view the most important issues facing us, or whether it is another very interesting framework that has all sorts of insights and we should always bear in mind, is it one of the pack or is it the ace in the pack? I remain agnostic on that. But I tell you what, I really do like the fact that I think the one useful thing about this framework is it does juggle the cards of some very old debates that have been quite stale, and it plays them in a slightly different way. And it just feels a bit fresher than left, right, and Labour Conservative. So there's really a lot in there, and I would heartily recommend it. On that note, I think we should thank our panel for their stimulating contributions, to the book as well. And there's room for 100 people to go and have a drink at the Phoenix across the road.
Yeah, that's right.
When you've got the book.
And very warm thanks to Evan for facilitating.
I would just like to add my own thanks on behalf of Foyles to all of you for coming, and to our excellent panel for exploring the issues with such vigour and integrity. Before you all dash off to carry on the discussion over the road, do go past the book table on your way and pick up a copy of Regeneration. They're just out by the music till way. We're not doing a formal book signing or anything, but any of the contributors here tonight will be happy to sign copies if you pop on.
Can I just say one last thing? Also in the book there are, well actually from both the first book and this book, as the wonderful covers there, there is actually an exhibition of the art from the books at the Orbital Gallery, which is just around the corner. On Great New Water Street. I don't think that'll be open now, but we borrowed the covers which are on display there. But there's also John Myers' wonderful comic books from extracts from both of the books will be on display there. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you very much.